Dave.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome to Sofa Reviews. Today we're looking at part 2 of the Spider-Man trilogy.
Released in 2004, 2 years after the first film, it's also set 2 years after the first film.
We're treated to yet another long opening credit sequence, but this one at least does have pictures giving a brief overview of the events of the first film.
The film opens with Peter struggling to do his pizza delivery job.
If only there was some way that he could avoid all that traffic, perhaps by swinging from one building to another.
After almost crashing several times, he remembers that he's actually Spider-Man and his job becomes very easy.
Of course, he still gets there late and ends up being fired, but luckily he visits Jameson to cheer himself up.
I don't pay you to be a sensitive artiste. I pay you because, still not now, I pay you because for some reason that psycho Spider-Man will pose for you.
He eventually provides a picture for Jameson, but is apparently still struggling for money.
We also find out that he's missing classes, failing at school, and forgetting other minor details.
Surprise! Well, say something!
What's the occasion?
Oh, really, Peter? It's your birthday. Whether you'll want to remember it or not.
After establishing that Harry's bitterness towards Spider-Man has strained their relationship, it's revealed that Aunt May might lose her house.
Because this isn't enough information in a small amount of time, we're also told that Mary Jane has a boyfriend.
Finally, Peter has a chat with his landlord, who he obviously owes rent money to, before he goes back to his crappy little apartment.
The next day, Harry takes Peter to meet Dr. Octavius, as he knows that Peter is writing a report on his work.
Peter instantly understands his work on fusion, and they end up chatting for most of the day.
Because he owes money to Betty Brandt, his landlord, and knows that his aunt is struggling for money, he decides to buy a ticket to Mary Jane's play.
Of course, on the way he's almost killed by some criminals before taking a slight detour to go save the day.
This means that he's late arriving for the play, but luckily Bruce Campbell is there to help him out.
Miss Watson? She's a friend of mine. She asked me to come.
But not to come late.
After sitting outside for the entire play, he goes to approach Mary Jane but gives up when her boyfriend turns up and some police cars drive past.
He leaps into action as Spider-Man, only to discover he's having some performance issues.
The next day, Peter and Harry go to see Dr. Octavius and his experiment, where he can show off his new robotic arms.
If the artificial intelligence in the arms is as advanced as you suggest, couldn't that make you vulnerable to them?
How right you are. Which is why I developed this inhibitor chip to protect my higher brain function.
But don't worry, it's incredibly fragile, and part of the AI programming for fusion reactions is contempt for human life.
The reaction starts off well, but things soon start going wrong as it turns out the miniature sun they've created is also magnetic.
So magnetic it can draw metal off the wall and even attracts glass to kill Octavius' wife, but doesn't attract earrings.
Spider-Man manages to stop the reaction, but not before the inhibitor chip is destroyed.
Later, in the hospital, the AI attempts another fusion reaction, but gets a bit confused and ends up killing everyone in the room.
Octavius wakes up and is led off to a remote location by the claws, before we spend some more time with Jameson.
New villain in town, Doc Ock.
Genius.
What, are you looking for a raise? Get out.
This is followed by Octavius listening to the voices in his head, as the claws tell him to attempt the experiment again, because at least this time he doesn't have a wife to lose.
He goes to rob a bank to fund his experiment, and it turns out it's the same bank that Peter and Aunt May are getting refused a loan at.
Peter bravely abandons his elderly aunt, leaving her at the mercy of a madman so that he can put on a spandex outfit.
Spider-Man turns up and starts battling Dr. Octopus, but gets quickly knocked down when his powers fail him.
Luckily, his powers return almost instantly so that he can avoid being killed.
Octavius is knocked outside and just so happens to kidnap Aunt May so the police can't shoot him.
Spider-Man chases him up the building as they battle, and despite all the times that Spider-Man hits Octavius, we see that Aunt May with an umbrella actually does more damage.
Spider-Man saves Aunt May and Octavius escapes, and so we cut to later on in the evening where Peter Parker is taking pictures for Jameson at a social event.
It turns out this is where Harry has decided to go to get drunk, and Mary Jane is there as well because she's dating Jameson's son, John.
He tries to speak with Mary Jane outside, but it turns out she wants nothing to do with him anymore.
But my best friend, who cares so much about me, can't make an 8 o'clock curtain.
It's just a play. It's not like he didn't show up to donate you a kidney.
After having an argument with Harry, he discovers that Mary Jane is engaged and decides to go to see a doctor about his powers disappearing.
Nothing as bad as uncertainty.
I'm hoping you don't also work as a rape counsellor.
In a dream sequence, Peter is speaking with Uncle Ben before he decides that he's no longer going to be Spider-Man, and then we see him throwing away his costume.
Having made this decision, certain genes kindly turn themselves off, meaning Peter needs his glasses back and his muscles have presumably wasted away.
We get a montage of Peter Parker enjoying his life, even managing to see Mary Jane's play and try to patch things up with her.
Meanwhile, Jameson is shown Spider-Man's costume and works out that he must have quit.
Peter confesses to Aunt May how he was responsible for Uncle Ben's death, before we see that Octavius has completed preparations for his experiment.
He goes to visit Harry, and after threatening to kill him, they make a deal.
Kill Spider-Man, we'll give you all the tritium you need. On second thought, bring him to me.
Meanwhile, Peter manages to save a child from a burning building without his powers.
Luckily, the first Asian couple he sees are the parents, rather than selling the child into slavery.
Afterwards, he visits Aunt May, who is moving out of her house and has quickly forgiven Peter.
Because the kid from over the road thinks he's cool, Peter decides to be Spider-Man again, and he decides the best way to reactivate his genes is by throwing himself off a roof.
The next day, he visits Mary Jane. She realises that she still loves him, but he realises that he can't be with her if he's going to be Spider-Man again.
The next scene is one of those awkward moments that we've all had at some point in our lives, where you spot someone that you know and you want to ask them something, but you accidentally throw a car at them instead.
As Peter manages to dodge the car, Octavius grabs him and demands that he tell Spider-Man to meet him later that afternoon before he throws him into a wall and kidnaps Mary Jane.
Luckily, Peter is Spider-Man, as otherwise he'd be off to hospital, and it seems being so magnificently cock-blocked is enough to restore his powers.
It then cuts to Jameson, who's had a revelation about Spider-Man.
Spider-Man was a hero. I just couldn't see it. He was a thief! A criminal!
He confronts Octavius and they immediately start fighting, ending up on top of a moving train.
This fight is the highlight of the movie and is very exciting and fun. It ends when Peter has to stop the train after the controls have been destroyed.
We're treated to a view of Peter's O-face as he finally manages to stop the train.
He's carried to the back of the train before the civilians thank him and give him back his mask.
Thankfully, this is quickly broken up when Octavius shows up and demonstrates how the Green Goblin should have dealt with tedious civilians.
Having captured Spider-Man, he delivers him to Harry in exchange for the tritium.
If only I could cause you the pain that you've caused me.
Joke's on you, his dad died years ago.
Harry discovers that Peter is Spider-Man, which gives Peter enough time to escape.
He then inexplicably works out exactly where Octavius is conducting his new experiment and attempts to stop him.
After more battling, Peter manages to remind Octavius who he really is, before convincing him to stop the experiment, after which Mary Jane discovers that Peter's Spider-Man as well.
As he's being slowly crushed to death, Peter decides now is the perfect time to declare his undying love for Mary Jane.
Octavius manages to drown the reaction as well as himself as Mary Jane and Peter escape.
Then you know why we can't be together. Spider-Man will always have enemies. I can't let you take that risk.
Yeah, because she's been perfectly safe when she didn't know who you were.
He then returns her to her fiancé before we cut back to Harry.
He's been drinking the same brilliant whiskey as his father, and so is able to have a chat with him.
As Harry discovers his father's secret goblin cave, Mary Jane jilts her fiancé before she gets abandoned by Spider-Man. In conclusion, I really like this film. It builds on the previous movie to make this one a whole lot better. Firstly, there's a lot more variety in the action. Spider-Man uses his webs in a lot of different ways, such as creating the web balls, huge nets, and trying to catch people as they're falling. What's more, every fight scene between Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus is very fun and exciting. And special mention has to go to the hospital scene, where an unconscious Dr. Octopus is killing all of the hospital staff without even realising it. It's a very dark and horrific scene, but it's also very stylish and very much of Sam Raimi's calibre.
Well, yeah, there's lots of fun and exciting action scenes, but none of it seems to really make sense. I mean, I can accept the claws being fairly quick and able to fight Spider-Man, but Octavius is just meant to be a middle-aged scientist. Surely Spider-Man could knock this guy out with a single punch.
True, but he is a much better villain than the previous movie. He comes across as being a competent and focused villain, while at the same time being powerful and a unique threat to Spider-Man. I also really like Alfred Molina's performance as Dr. Octopus, inhabiting the character as an intelligent villain rather than just goofy and insane.
Although sadly we do still have to put up with all the tedious melodrama with Mary Jane and her precious play. But I suppose they had to carry on with that from the first film. What I find more irritating in this one is all the tedious subplots with money issues. Why does Aunt May have to be having trouble with her house in the first place? How is delivering pizzas not the easiest job in the world for Peter? If he was really struggling for money, couldn't he have just asked Harry for a job? And at the end of the day, if Peter and Aunt May have money issues, surely he could move back in with her to help contribute and pay the rent, which would also cut down on his own bills.
It does allow Aunt May to actually get a few more scenes and get some emotions out of her, even getting angry at Peter Parker rather than being some sort of cartoony mother. It helped her become more of a rounded character, which is always nice. It's also nice to see the Daily Bugle staff again, especially Jameson, who's always the best thing about these movies.
Definitely, but his brilliant presence is sadly again limited in this film and doesn't make up for a lot of the annoying inconsistencies. At one point, Octavius has Spider-Man's head trapped between two claws, but doesn't kill him, despite the fact we later see his claws have knives in them. Surely, after 2 years of Spider-Man being in the city, crime would be drastically reduced, and so he shouldn't be as tired as he is. Also, weren't the police actually trying to arrest Spider-Man in the first film? And finally, it's quite annoying that it still comes across that Peter would be better off with either his landlord's daughter or Betty Brant rather than the vacuous Mary Jane.
At the end of the day, I genuinely enjoyed this film. It's one of the best Spider-Man movies to date.
Again, this is a decent film with some inconsistencies that is sadly bogged down by Peter's obsession with a worthless tart.
You serious?
He goes off to rob a bank. Scene done.
That is what he does. He does go off to rob a bank.
He later tries to take over the world. It doesn't work out well.
He died.
Spoilers.
The end.
Yes.